Introduction and Mysterious Beginnings. The Eclipse had been forgotten. For years, it sat abandoned in the quiet depths of space, hidden away from the world. This ship, once a proud symbol of humanity's strength, was now nothing more than a relic, a broken-down vessel discarded after the end of the Great War. It was a war that humanity had lost. Most of Earth's finest ships were destroyed in the battle against the alien fleets, and the Eclipse was no different. But while other ships were melted down or repurposed, this one was left to rot, out of sight and out of mind. Captain Aria stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, staring at the view screen. The stars glimmered outside, quiet and distant, almost mocking her. She had been given command of this ship, though no one truly believed in its ability to fight. It was an old ship, outdated, and it had failed in the past. To many, it was a ghost ship, an abandoned hope. The Eclipse had a reputation for being unlucky. It had been part of the human fleet during the war, but when the enemy armada arrived, the ship was quickly left behind. There were no grand stories of victory for the Eclipse. Instead, there were whispers of failure and retreat, of a ship that couldn't keep up. Now, the once dominant vessel was reduced to a forgotten hulk, gathering dust in the shadows of a dying war. Captain Aria, however, saw something different in the ship. While others scoffed at the idea of using it again, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Eclipse still had more to offer. Something about the ship's structure, its strange design, and the systems hidden deep within it seemed to whisper a different story, one that no one else had seen. Perhaps it wasn't as useless as they thought. Maybe, just maybe, it was a forgotten weapon waiting to be awakened. She had spent the last few weeks going over the Eclipse with a fine-tooth comb, poring over every file and system the ship had. Some parts of the ship had been damaged beyond repair, but other sections, especially the core technology, held promise. Ancient technology, once thought outdated, might still have hidden powers waiting to be unlocked. But despite her excitement, Aria had to admit, it wasn't easy to convince the crew. The officers and soldiers aboard were mostly new recruits, assigned to a forgotten ship that had no reputation, no glory. They came from ships with shiny, advanced technology, ships with the latest weapons and armor. Why would they want to serve on a ghost ship like the Eclipse? Some of the crew openly doubted her judgment. They muttered in the halls, questioning whether this was a mission worth their time. They had heard the stories. The Eclipse had been part of the failed missions that led to humanity's defeat in the war. Aria knew their doubts, and yet she couldn't let go of the belief that this ship still held power. She had to believe it, for her and for the future of humanity. The first few days were rough. The crew didn't respect her at first. She wasn't like the other captains who led modern, flashy ships with massive crews. She was just a captain of an old, forgotten vessel. But Aria had something that none of them had, a fierce determination, a belief that something bigger was hidden in the Eclipse, something that no one else had yet discovered. She walked the halls of the ship late at night, deep in thought, her boots echoing on the cold metal floors. The ship felt different now, alive with possibility. There were old files, logs, and artifacts hidden in the archives, waiting to be examined. Most of the crew saw them as junk, relics of a time long past. But Aria understood that sometimes the past holds secrets that could change the future. In the engine room, a team of engineers worked on restoring the ship's power core. The Eclipse had once run on advanced fusion power, capable of sustaining the ship through the longest of journeys. But now, the power was weak, barely enough to run the most basic systems. Aria knew it would take time to restore the ship to full strength, but she wasn't in a rush. For now, she focused on what she could control, building the crew's trust. They needed to believe in the ship, in her, and in their mission. But it wasn't just about the Eclipse. It was about the future of humanity. The war might be over, but the galaxy was still a dangerous place. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. And Aria knew, deep down, that the Eclipse could play a key role in whatever was to come. The crew was still unsure. They didn't understand why Aria was so passionate about a ship that was supposed to be retired. But soon, they would have no choice but to follow her. Something was coming. A new threat, something far worse than any enemy they had faced before. Aria gazed out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. The eclipse might have been forgotten by others, but it would not be forgotten by her. She would unlock its secrets, and when the time came, it would be the ship to lead humanity to victory once again. The Armada approaches. Days passed, and Captain Aria's faith in the eclipse continued to grow, though the crew's skepticism remained. The ship still needed repairs, and the weapons systems hadn't yet been fully tested. But then, a distress signal came, a signal that would change everything. A human colony, hidden on a distant planet, had come under attack. The message was clear. A massive alien armada was headed straight for them. The enemy fleet was unlike anything humanity had faced before. Huge, heavily armed, and equipped with advanced technology that outmatched anything in the human arsenal. The colony was vulnerable, and without help, it wouldn't survive. The news spread quickly through the eclipse, and fear began to spread among the crew. No one had faith that their old ship could stand up against an enemy force of that size. But Aria knew this was their moment. The eclipse had been left behind for a reason. It had something special hidden deep within its hull. And now she had to prove that the ship was more than just a relic. She called an emergency meeting in the ship's command center. The crew gathered around her, looking uncertain. Aria stood tall in front of them, her expression firm. "I know you all have doubts," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "But I can feel it in this ship. The eclipse has the power to do something that no one expects. It's not just a scrap of old metal. This ship still has fight left in it, and we will make sure the colony survives." There was a long silence. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to trust her words. But in the end, there was no choice. The enemy was coming, and they had to act fast. Aria ordered the ship to power up, and as the engines hummed to life, the crew scrambled to their stations. The eclipse was slow to respond, but it was moving, inching its way toward the colony. The crew worked frantically to repair what they could, trying to get the ship's weaponry and shields back online. Everyone knew the eclipse wouldn't be able to hold off the Armada for long, but it was the only hope they had. The sensors picked up the alien fleet, its immense size lighting up the screens. Aria's heart raced as she looked at the numbers. The Armada was enormous. Hundreds of ships, many of them larger and more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. The enemy had overwhelming firepower, and their ships were equipped with energy weapons that could cut through human defenses like butter. "This is it," Aria whispered to herself. The eclipse was no match for the enemy fleet in terms of size or firepower, but it was the only ship that could make a difference now. They had no choice but to fight. The crew worked together, setting the course for the colony's defense zone. Aria issued orders with precision, directing her crew to keep the ship in motion while they prepared for the incoming battle. The alien armada was closing in, and their attack was imminent. But the eclipse wasn't just going to sit back and be destroyed. It was going to fight back. As they neared the colony, the first shots were fired. The alien ships unleashed a barrage of laser beams that lit up the void of space, and the eclipse shook as the shields absorbed the initial hits. Aria's hands gripped the command chair as the ship jolted with each blast. The crew's faces were tense, but no one backed down. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared throughout the ship. A massive alien warship had locked onto them, its weapons ready to fire. Aria's mind raced. She had only moments to react. Without thinking, she ordered a full-speed maneuver, a risky course change designed to dodge the enemy's attack. The eclipse lurched forward, its engines roaring to life as it shot toward the alien ship. The crew held on tightly as the ship banked to the side, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire. The alien ship fired again, this time aimed directly at the eclipse. But just as it was about to hit, something incredible happened. The Eclipse's long-forgotten weapon systems, hidden deep within the ship, came online. A massive burst of energy shot from the ship's underside, striking the alien vessel with stunning force. The enemy ship's shields cracked under the assault, and a massive explosion tore through its hull. The crew stared in shock. Aria felt her pulse quicken. The Eclipse had done it. It had actually fought back, and it had won. But the battle wasn't over. The alien armada wasn't going to give up that easily. As the Eclipse dodged more blasts, it became clear that the ship was far from fully repaired. The systems were still unstable, and the crew was running low on power. The battle was going to get much harder before it was over. Aria's mind raced, but she kept her focus. The Eclipse had shown it could fight. And now, it was up to her and the crew to push it to its limits. "Keep fighting," she said, her voice strong. "We're not done yet." Unexpected power. The battle raged on, and Aria's pulse raced as she watched the chaotic exchange of fire between the Eclipse and the alien armada. The ship was pushing its limits, its systems flickering with instability, but Aria had no choice but to keep fighting. The enemy fleet seemed endless, and every blast that hit the Eclipse sent shockwaves through her body. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, and the crew was working around the clock to keep everything running. The Eclipse had already taken heavy damage, and several of the forward weapon systems were offline. But as Aria glanced at the tactical display, she saw a new threat. The enemy flagship, the largest and most powerful ship in the Armada, was coming directly toward them. It was heavily shielded and armed with the most advanced weapons. This was their biggest challenge yet, and Aria knew that if they didn't take it down, the Eclipse would be destroyed. And so would the colony they were trying to protect. "Captain, we can't hold them off much longer," the ship's tactical officer shouted, his voice tense with panic. "We're running low on power, and we've lost half of our forward shields." Aria glanced at the crew. They were exhausted, their faces drawn with fear, but she saw the same determination in their eyes that she felt herself. They hadn't given up. Not yet. The Eclipse was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of hope, a last stand for humanity's survival. "Increase speed, avoid their direct fire, and target their engines," Aria ordered, her voice steady. "We may not have the firepower to take them head-on, but we can cripple them." The crew scrambled to follow her orders, maneuvering the Eclipse with agility that surprised even Aria. It wasn't the fastest ship in the fleet, but in the hands of her skilled crew, it was proving more than capable of evasive maneuvers. As the enemy flagship closed in, Aria knew they had only one chance to stop it. The Eclipse's weapons systems had always been underused, deemed obsolete by the fleet command. But as the flagship bore down on them, something remarkable happened. A surge of energy coursed through the ship, something Aria hadn't seen before. The weapons system, dormant for so long, flared to life with a violent burst. The Eclipse's cannons fired in rapid succession, a torrent of energy blasts shooting across the void of space. The enemy flagship was hit with such force that its shields buckled, and its massive structure trembled. For a moment, Aria could hardly believe what she was seeing. The Eclipse, a ship thought to be outdated, a relic of the past, was holding its ground against the most powerful ship in the enemy fleet. "Direct hit," the tactical officer called out. "They're losing power in their engines." Aria didn't waste a second. "Keep firing. We've got them now." The crew worked in perfect synchronization, the once disbelieving officers now fully trusting in their captain's leadership and the ship's hidden potential. With each passing moment, the Eclipse's weapons grew stronger. The alien flagship, though powerful, began to falter. Its shields were no match for the revived weapons of the Eclipse, and within moments, its engines were crippled, leaving it vulnerable. But the fight wasn't over. As the flagship began to list and lose altitude, the rest of the enemy fleet turned its attention to the Eclipse, furious at the loss of their most prized warship. The enemy fighters swarmed, firing relentlessly, and the Eclipse shook violently with each hit. Aria's mind raced as she considered their options. "Captain, the forward shields are failing," shouted the engineer. "We can't take much more damage." Aria knew they couldn't sustain this. The Eclipse was powerful, but it was still an old ship. It wasn't designed to withstand the kind of punishment the alien fleet was dishing out. Still, the crew had proven they were capable of more than anyone thought. And so had the ship. She quickly formulated a daring plan. "Set course for the heart of their fleet," she said. "We're going to take out their command ship. If we can cripple their leadership, the rest will fall apart." The crew hesitated for a moment, but then they all understood. This was their chance. If they could destroy the command ship, they could shatter the alien armada's coordination. With everything they had, the Eclipse surged forward, taking on the swarm of enemy fighters that surrounded them. The enemy's weapons fired in quick succession, but the Eclipse evaded the blasts, its newly awakened systems guiding them through the hail of enemy fire. The ship's hidden technology, the very technology that had been left forgotten for years, was now their greatest asset. "Target the command ship," Aria ordered. The Eclipse's guns locked onto the enemy flagship, unleashing everything they had left. Energy blasts ripped through the enemy ship's shields, and with one final devastating shot, the flagship exploded in a brilliant burst of light. A cheer erupted from the crew. The alien fleet, leaderless and disoriented, began to break apart. Their fighters scattered, and their remaining ships began retreating, realizing that the battle was lost. Aria stood at the command center, watching as the enemy forces fled. The Eclipse had done it. The forgotten ship, the one everyone had abandoned, had led the charge and secured victory. Against all odds, humanity had won. "Captain," the communications officer said, breaking the silence. "The colony is safe. They're reporting no casualties. We've done it." Aria smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. She turned to the crew, proud of their bravery and determination. "This isn't over," she said. "But today, we've shown that even the most forgotten ship can rise and lead. The Eclipse isn't finished yet." The fight intensifies. The cheers of the crew echoed through the Eclipse, but the celebration was short-lived. The battle was far from over, and even with the alien flagship destroyed, the remaining forces were still formidable. The enemy fleet, though in disarray, was not defeated completely. They still had hundreds of ships, and many were regrouping, preparing for another round. Captain Aria knew that victory was not guaranteed until the last alien ship had been pushed back. The Eclipse was still damaged, and though it had shown incredible power, it was clear that the ship couldn't keep up this pace for much longer. She glanced at the tactical display, watching as the alien ships began to form a new battle line. "Captain, we've got more enemy ships coming in. They're regrouping for another assault," said the tactical officer, his voice filled with urgency. Aria nodded grimly. She had expected this. The aliens were smart, and they wouldn't give up easily. But the Eclipse had something they didn't, the element of surprise. While the rest of the human fleet would likely be outgunned, the Eclipse had already shown that it could stand toe-to-toe with the enemy's strongest ships. Now, it was time to push that advantage. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're going to take out their smaller ships first," Aria ordered, her voice steady but determined. "Target their engines and weapon systems. We need to slow them down, one ship at a time." The crew worked quickly, adjusting the ship's course and preparing the weapons for the next wave. The Eclipse wasn't fast, but its agility had improved significantly after its systems had been partially restored. As the enemy ships closed in, the Eclipse darted forward, slipping between the alien warships like a ghost in the dark. The enemy wasn't ready for this. The Eclipse's weapons fired again, a steady barrage of energy blasts that struck enemy fighters and smaller ships. Each shot hit its mark, and the aliens struggled to counter the ship's unpredictable movements. The Eclipse wasn't simply taking hits, It was dealing them back harder than ever. Direct hits on their fighter fleet. The communications officer reported. They're scattering. Some of their ships are trying to retreat. The tide was turning. For every enemy fighter that fell, another retreated, leaving the larger ships exposed. It was time for the Eclipse to make its next move. Aria's hands tightened on the control panel. The main cannons were still fully charged, and she knew that a single well-placed strike could destroy another group of enemies. But she needed to make sure the crew was ready. Their energy levels were dangerously low, and the ship's systems were beginning to strain. "Engineer, what's the status on the power core?" Aria asked, turning to the officer stationed at the power controls. "We're running at 70% efficiency, Captain," the engineer replied, sweat dripping from his brow. "It's enough for a few more shots, but if we don't get the shields back online soon, we'll be sitting ducks." Aria's mind raced. The ship's power core had never been designed to handle such heavy combat usage, but the crew had no other choice. She had to trust that they could make it work. "Deploy the remaining power to the shields and main weapons," Aria ordered. "We're going to need every ounce of strength to take down their flagship reinforcements." The crew quickly adjusted the ship's power distribution, sending what little energy they had left to the vital systems. The Eclipse shuddered as the new load was applied, but it held together. For now, the enemy fleet began to press forward again, their remaining warships charging in for the final push. They had been forced back once, but they were not finished. Their guns locked onto the Eclipse, and a barrage of fire rained down on the ship. The Eclipse's shields flared under the assault, but they held. Aria's heart raced as she realized they had only moments to act. She locked onto the lead alien ship, a massive vessel with glowing energy cannons capable of destroying entire fleets in one shot. "Target their energy core," she said, her voice cold with focus. "One shot. That's all we have." The weapons officer nodded, fingers flying over the console as he aimed the Eclipse's most powerful weapon. The ship's main cannons hummed to life, their energy core lighting up as they prepared for the final strike. Time seemed to slow as the weapon charged. The Eclipse rocked with the incoming fire, but Aria kept her eyes locked on the alien warship. With a single command, the cannons unleashed their fury. The shot flew through space, and with a brilliant flash of light, the alien ship's core exploded. The shockwave rippled through space, sending a wave of energy across the battlefield. The remaining enemy ships faltered, their momentum halted by the destruction of their lead vessel. "Target the remaining ships," Aria ordered, not giving them any time to recover. The Eclipse fired again and again, hitting their targets with surgical precision. The alien ships began to break apart, retreating in confusion. The Eclipse had done it again. It had turned the tide. The battle was nearly won. But Aria knew better than to relax. They had dealt a heavy blow to the enemy fleet, but there were still more ships out there. And there was no telling what kind of retaliation they could expect. As the enemy forces scattered, she steeled herself for whatever came next. "We've got their attention now," Aria said under her breath. "But we're not done yet. This is just the beginning." A desperate gamble. The Eclipse was battered, but it wasn't beaten. The battle had taken its toll, and the alien forces had retreated, at least for now. Aria stared at the tactical display, watching as the last of the enemy ships withdrew into the vastness of space. The Eclipse had won, but the victory felt hollow. The battle was far from over, and Aria knew that a second wave of attacks was imminent. The question wasn't if the enemy would return, but when. "Captain, we're barely holding on," said the engineer, his voice strained. "We've used almost all of our remaining power. Shields are at 10%, and our main guns are offline. We need to restock and repair." Aria clenched her jaw. She knew that the ship was on the brink of failure. It was a miracle they had survived this long. But they couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Aria ordered. "We need to keep moving." The last thing we want is to be sitting ducks if the enemy comes back. The crew sprang into action, but there was no hiding the truth. They were out of time. If the alien armada regrouped and attacked with full force, the Eclipse wouldn't last another fight. It wasn't just about the ship anymore. It was about the future of humanity. The colony was still vulnerable, and without them, the war could easily be lost. Aria paced the bridge, her mind racing. The only way to stop the enemy once and for all was to deal a decisive blow, but that would require more firepower than the Eclipse had left. They needed to take out the enemy's command fleet. If they could destroy their leadership, the rest of the armada would crumble. It was a risky plan, one that could either win the war or result in their destruction. "Lieutenant," Aria said, turning to her second-in-command, "we've been playing defense long enough. It's time we take the fight to them. I want to know everything we can about their fleet. We're going to launch a surprise attack." The lieutenant's eyes widened. "Captain, you're talking about attacking their core fleet directly. While we're in this condition, we'll never make it." Aria turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "If we don't, they'll come for us anyway. We're the last line of defense. And if we don't act now, this battle won't be the last. I'm not letting the Eclipse go down like this, not after everything we've done." The crew exchanged nervous glances, but Aria's confidence was infectious. They had already been through so much together, and they had come this far. They knew that a direct assault on the enemy's command fleet would be a suicide mission, but they also knew that, without it, the war would continue, and humanity might not survive. "We'll do it," the lieutenant said quietly, stepping forward. "What's the plan?" Aria drew a deep breath. "We'll use the Eclipse's stealth mode to get in close. We'll disable their smaller ships first, take out their defenses. Once we've made a hole in their perimeter, we go for their command ship. We hit them hard and fast." No hesitation. The crew nodded, though the weight of the mission was clear. Everyone knew the risks. They were heading into the heart of the enemy's strength, and they might not return. But for Aria, there was no other choice. The Eclipse had shown its power, but it had also shown its limits. Their only chance now was to surprise the enemy with everything they had left. The Eclipse slowly powered up, the faint hum of the ship's engines echoing through the silence of space. The repairs were minimal, just enough to get them moving. Aria watched as the ship's stealth systems activated, cloaking the vessel from the enemy sensors. They were nearly invisible, at least for now. "We're on course for the enemy's central fleet," said the navigation officer. "Ready to engage when you give the word." Aria stood at the helm, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. No more second chances. "Prepare for Phase 1, she said, voice steady. "We hit them fast. We hit them hard." The crew braced themselves as the Eclipse surged forward, its stealth mode keeping them undetected. The enemy fleet was within range, and they had no idea the Eclipse was coming. As they approached the first wave of enemy ships, Aria issued the first command. "Target their engines. Disable their smaller vessels. We need to break through their defense perimeter." The Eclipse fired first, catching the enemy off guard. Its weapons systems, though limited, were still powerful enough to tear through the alien ships. The enemy's defenses crumbled as their smaller vessels were disabled one by one. But the real challenge was coming. The heart of the enemy fleet, their command ship, the flagship that had been the source of their overwhelming power. "Now's our chance," Aria said, her voice sharp. "Lock onto the flagship. Full power to the weapons." The crew worked in perfect unison as the Eclipse locked onto its target. The alien flagship loomed large in the distance, surrounded by smaller ships trying to recover from the sudden assault. With everything they had left, the Eclipse fired a devastating barrage at the flagship's shield generators. The blast struck hard, and the alien ship trembled under the impact. "They're weakening," the tactical officer reported. "We've got them." Aria's eyes narrowed as she prepared to give the final order. But just as the Eclipse moved in for the kill, The enemy flagship launched a retaliatory strike. Massive energy beams that tore through space, heading straight for the Eclipse. "This is it," Aria whispered under her breath. She had no choice but to gamble everything on this final strike. "Brace for impact," she shouted. "The ultimate victory." The Eclipse rocked as the enemy's retaliatory blasts slammed into its weakened shields. The ship shuddered violently, and alarms blared across the bridge. Aria's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the control panel, but her mind remained focused. The Eclipse was taking hits, but it wasn't giving up. "Shields at 5%, Captain," the engineer called out, his voice strained. "We can't take much more of this." Aria's gaze never left the view screen. The enemy flagship was still charging its weapons, and every blast brought them closer to the brink of destruction. But the Eclipse wasn't done yet. "We're not stopping," Aria shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Prepare for a full-speed charge. We're going to take them down." Her command was clear. The crew worked in frantic unison, knowing that the only way they would survive this fight was to push the Eclipse to its absolute limits. The ship's engines roared to life, pushing the vessel forward despite the damage it had sustained. "Captain, we can't engage at this speed," the tactical officer warned. "We'll be sitting targets for every other ship in the fleet." "We have no choice." Aria snapped back. "Full speed ahead. If we don't finish this now, we'll be destroyed. I won't let that happen." The Eclipse shot forward, using its remaining energy to break through the chaos and charge toward the enemy flagship. The ship's systems groaned in protest as they fought to keep up with the orders, but it held together. The crew had proven time and time again that they could push this ship to do the impossible. And now, they would do it again. As they approached the enemy flagship, Aria saw it all coming together. The alien fleet, though still formidable, was now scrambling. The Eclipse had torn through their outer defenses, leaving the flagship vulnerable. With a steady hand, Aria aimed the ship's remaining energy at the flagship's core. "Target the core. All weapons, now," she commanded. The ship's guns fired with a deafening roar, a brilliant streak of energy cutting through space and slamming into the alien flagship. The shields flared, but they couldn't hold. The Eclipse's weapons tore through the flagship's defenses, and with one final devastating blow, the core exploded. The alien flagship, the heart of their fleet, shattered in a massive explosion, sending debris scattering in all directions. For a brief moment, there was silence. The crew of the Eclipse stared in disbelief, not fully understanding what had just happened. They had done it. They had destroyed the flagship. The alien fleet, leaderless and scattered, had no choice but to retreat. "Enemy fleet in full retreat," the tactical officer shouted. "They're abandoning the battlefield." Aria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her fingers shook slightly as she wiped sweat from her brow. The Eclipse had done it. It had led humanity to victory. Against all odds, against the overwhelming power of the alien armada, they had won. But the battle wasn't over just yet. As Aria glanced around at her crew, she knew this victory was only the beginning of a new chapter. The Eclipse had proven that even the most underestimated ship could rise to greatness, but there would be more battles to fight. The enemy may have retreated, but they would not stay gone forever. There was still much to be done. "Captain," the communications officer said, his voice trembling. "The colony is reporting no casualties. They're safe. We did it." Aria smiled, her chest swelling with pride. The ship, the crew, together, they had made the impossible possible. They had saved the colony and struck a blow against an enemy that had seemed invincible. "Get ready," Aria said, turning to her crew. "This victory won't be our last. The galaxy may be quiet for now, but we're not done. The Eclipse will rise again." The crew of the Eclipse nodded in agreement. They were no longer just survivors of a lost war. They were heroes, and the Eclipse, the forgotten ship, was their symbol of strength, the legacy of the eclipse. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The eclipse had done the unthinkable. Against impossible odds, it had broken through the alien armada, destroyed the flagship, and saved the colony. Aria stood on the bridge, looking out at the wreckage of the alien fleets scattered across the battlefield. A wave of relief washed over her, but she knew this victory was just the beginning of something bigger. The galaxy was not safe yet, and many threats still lingered in the dark corners of space. The crew of the Eclipse had proven themselves in ways no one could have imagined. They were no longer the underdogs, no longer the crew of a forgotten ship. They were warriors, heroes who had fought and won. They had made history. Aria turned to face her crew. Every face on the bridge showed signs of exhaustion, but there was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They had done something extraordinary. They had brought hope to humanity when it seemed like all was lost. "Captain, the fleet is requesting our status," the communications officer reported, his voice filled with awe. Aria nodded. "Send our report. Tell them the Eclipse is still standing, and we've secured the victory. The aliens are retreating, and the colony is safe. But this war isn't over. Not yet." She paused, looking out at the stars. It had been a long, hard road to this moment, but the Eclipse had proven its worth. The ship that was once written off as useless, forgotten, and abandoned had emerged as humanity's last hope. And now it had a new purpose. The message was sent, and soon the human fleet arrived to clean up the remnants of the alien armada. The Eclipse's victory would be known across the galaxy. Aria and her crew would be hailed as heroes, their names etched into history. But Aria knew that the true legacy of the Eclipse wasn't just in the victory they'd won. It was in the message they had sent to the galaxy. Humanity was not weak. Humanity could rise, even when the odds were stacked against them. As the fleet began to recover and regroup, Aria received a message from the surviving commanders. Their words were filled with respect and gratitude. But there was one thing that stood out above all else. They wanted the Eclipse and its crew to lead the next phase of the war. "We've won a battle," Aria said quietly to herself. "But this is just the beginning. They want us to take the fight to their home world." The message was clear. Humanity had a chance now, a chance to reclaim their place in the galaxy. The Eclipse would be the ship to lead them. No longer would humanity hide in fear. It was time to take the fight to the enemy, to hunt them down where they thought they were safe. Aria had no illusions about what this meant. It would be dangerous. But now, with the Eclipse by their side, humanity had a fighting chance. In the weeks that followed, the Eclipse was repaired and upgraded. The crew worked tirelessly to ensure the ship was at its best. They knew what was coming. Aria had already begun training her crew for the next phase. They would not repeat the mistakes of the past. They would strike first, and they would strike hard. The Eclipse was ready. As Aria looked over the ship's bridge one last time, she saw the faces of her crew, tired but determined. They had fought for survival, but now they were fighting for a future where humanity was no longer a footnote in the galaxy, but a force to be reckoned with. And it would all start with the Eclipse. Aria's gaze lifted to the stars. "We've come this far," she said softly. "Now we go further. The galaxy isn't ready for what we're about to do. The Eclipse will lead the charge, and we'll be the ones to decide how this story ends." With that, Aria turned and gave the order. "Set course for their home world. We're not waiting anymore. It's time to end this." As the Eclipse powered up and began its journey into the unknown, Aria knew one thing for sure. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. The legacy of the Eclipse was just beginning, and it would carry humanity's hope for a better tomorrow, one battle at a time.